Crude, $100 a barrel is where it has crossed after Vladimir Putin announced the military operation in Ukraine as well, even as the UN Security Council meeting was underway. Joining us to talk more about crude is Vandana Hari. Vandana, thanks so much for joining us live today. We've seen the triple-digit mark after a very long time on our screens when it comes to crude. Are you guys factoring this in as the new normal? We all know this is bad news for India.
Good morning. Indeed, very bad news. I would say not just for India, but for the whole world. Just as economies are trying to claw their way out of the setbacks of COVID, inflation is a major concern around the world. Central banks are trying to tighten monetary policy. And, the last thing you needed was crude above $100. And still, I think it doesn't look like a blip to me. It looks like it could sustain and it could continue going higher until the Ukraine crisis is resolved. And what has happened this morning or in the last few hours is that while through the ups and downs of this crisis over the past few weeks, there was always a hope for a diplomatic de-escalation. It just has receded farther now. I mean, one wouldn't argue that it's completely out, but it's receded farther, which means basically we all need to tighten our belts for higher prices for, presumably at least a few weeks.
So you're anticipating $100 for at least a couple of weeks. This is, of course, maybe today what we've seen, a reaction to the military operation. But Vandana, there are many other moving parts to this. For example, what if the Iranian oil comes into the world energy mix?
Yes, there are, some mitigating factors. So one is, of course, the Iran deal, the revival of the nuclear deal between Iran and the US has been, the negotiations have been hailed as, most successful that of the past several months, and inching closer to a deal, and that has revived hope of about 1.3 million barrels per day of Iranian oil coming back into the market. But look, if sitting this morning, looking at the situation in Ukraine and the potential loss of Russian natural gas, oil, coal supplies to Europe, there's just no way to replace that. So whether you say, could Iran provide some relief? A very little bit, potentially. But again, that deal is not done until it is done. Could the release of strategic petroleum reserves provide some relief? Yes, potentially. That is also, again, in discussion. Maybe even an IEA coordinated release of reserves. But, if we are staring at a possible major disruption of Russian gas and oil supply to Europe, let us be very clear. There's absolutely no way for any other producer in the world.
Vandana, India, of course, is one of the largest importers of crude oil. 85% of our crude needs and energy needs are met by imports. If I can ask you to explain to our viewers what this triple-digit figure for crude is going to mean for India. And don't forget, we've not seen prices of petrol, diesel go up for many, many months, maybe because of the state elections. So I don't know if consumers also need to brace themselves for more mehungai.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, crude has had these super cycles and spikes previously. We have seen over $100 prices. More often than not, in the recent history, they were driven by strong demand. Now, when you have strong demand, which is being led by strong economic growth, a lot of the economies, certainly including emerging economies like India, have the potential to some extent to absorb those high oil prices. But this is a completely different situation. It's, the economies, India certainly, around the globe are struggling to revive themselves, to regain momentum after COVID. So this coming at a time when economies are struggling with, to regain momentum is, one couldn't think of a worse time for that to happen. Clearly, India is, the oil demand is rebounding pretty fast, post-COVID, and that's happening again around the world as the curbs are being eased. So India is being forced to import more and more crude at hugely expensive prices. It's a huge drain on the country's foreign exchange. It's going to put pressure on the rupee as well. So, I'm sorry, but I just can't see any silver lining in this. We can't expect a demand response in the current circumstances, at least not anything in the short term either.
Now, from a market's perspective, the high crude oil prices, of course, it might augur well for the likes of, let's say, an ONGC or an Oil India or a Vedanta, which is a business of exploration and production. But it's bad news for the downstream players, right? From an IOC to a BPCL to an HPCL to an MRPL. Would you have any facts on ground of, where the stockpiles are, the strategic reserves are for India too?
So, on your earlier point, indeed, this is good news for pure play upstream players, because obviously they're getting way higher prices for their not just crude, but natural gas production as well, especially in markets that are liberalized and that follow movements in the international prices of oil and gas. It's not very good news for refiners. And unfortunately, the refining sector has gone through a pretty bad patch throughout not just 2020 but 2021 as well. Because crude price gains have overtaken at all times the gains in fuel demand and the ability of the refiners to pass on the costs into refined product prices. So it's not looking good. Every time crude prices spike because of a situation like what we're currently seeing, and not because fuel demand is higher, it's just bad news for refiners.
And for India, like I said, 85% of our needs are met via imports. So would you have any information at all about our strategic reserves, how we have been importing our stockpiles? Because every country usually does try to hedge against the higher prices.
Yeah, so I think this is where perhaps India has lost out on an opportunity. The way to do this for countries that do not have historically have strategic reserves of oil, like the OECD countries do, the way to do it is for the countries to build these reserves and build the infrastructure and buy the oil when prices are relatively low by historical norms. And, India has been a late starter in terms of setting up the infrastructure and accumulating the strategic reserves. So India's strategic reserves compared are a fraction of its, daily consumption, and or rather monthly consumption. And that's what countries aim to do, is have at least 90 days worth of oil in strategic reserves. And if India had, now it's a moot argument, but if India had oil, perhaps at a time like this, it could have released some reserves and lessened the pain of high crude import costs on its refiners. But then again, this is something to keep in mind, perhaps once things stabilize and prices return to more normal levels.
Okay, let's see what the new normal is going to be. Today, of course, it's a sea of red across asset classes, maybe barring the safe havens like gold and crude, which is, of course, going up thanks to the geopolitical tension. Vladimir Putin announcing that military operation in Ukraine. Vandana, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us live today. We get you one of the most authoritative voices now on energy. This is the